Hello, everybody. Welcome to Random Review. Thank you for joining us. I'm Connie Georgiou. Deborah Goldenberg and I coordinate Random Review for Friends of the Library, which sponsors these events. Deborah, will you join me on screen and greet our audience?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the event today. I'll see you later.
And our library host today is Bonnie Brzezowski. She'll be fielding your questions at the end of the program. Bonnie, would you like to turn on your camera and say hello?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here.
A few operational details. If you're having any problems with GoToWebinar, please use the question or chat box on your control panel, and we'll try to help you. We are recording this presentation, so if your issues can't be resolved, please be assured that a link to the recording will be sent in your follow-up letter. Also, there will be a link to a more polished version on the Random Review page of the library website soon. We'll continue to have virtual events until it seems safe to meet in person again at the library, whenever that is. Also on the Random Review webpage, you'll find a link to a list of library books related to today's topic, created by our volunteer, Gail Gerdeman. And on the same page, you can sign up to receive monthly Random Review email announcements. We encourage you to submit questions for our speaker at any time during the presentation by just typing them into the question or the chat box, and she'll answer as many as we have time for at the end of the program. I want to let you know that the Friends Holiday Book Sale last weekend was a great success. A big thank you to everyone who joined us to volunteer or shop. The proceeds will be used for programming at all library branches. And now I'd like to thank our community sponsors of Random Review, Grassroots Books and Music, Northwest Graphic Imaging, the Corvallis GT, especially reporter Jim Day, and a big thank you to the best library and especially librarians, Bonnie Brzezowski and Mike Hansen, who provide indispensable support in the presentation of our virtual programs. And next time you're at the library, be sure to pick up one of our Random Review bookmarks with the year's schedule on it so you can see when the next review is. And speaking of the next review, our next program will be on January 12th, when reviewer Dee Kerwin will discuss After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America by Jessica Goudeau, a very interesting book. Now, I'd like to invite Carol Butcher, a member of our Random Review Selection Committee and a reviewer herself, to introduce today's speaker. Carol, you join me on screen, and I'll say goodbye until later.
Okay, thank you so much, Connie. This was such an interesting review and a fun book to read. When it was selected as a random review, I knew immediately that my friend, Abby Phillips Metzger, would be the perfect reviewer. Abby Phillips Metzger is a science communicator, author, paddler, dog lover, and she earned her honors English degree and master's in environmental science from Oregon State University. In addition to her current appointment as science writer and communicator at the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at OSU, she has worked in journalism, book publishing, environmental education. She is the author of Meander Scars, a reflection of the Willamette River. In this series of essays about river restoration, Abby explores how human activity has changed and scarred our river and how we might go about fixing it. I met Abby when she and others of us were working on the book that eventually became Wild in the Willamette, exploring the Mid-Valley's parks, trails, and natural areas. Abby was not only co-author of the book, but she personally hiked many of the trails and provided such compelling descriptions of what she discovered that even I, who am not an avid hiker, yearned to put my boots on. Most recently, her essay, Medium Matters, Making a Case for Middle-Sized Bioplankton, was recognized as a top pick by the Best Short Form Science Writing Project. Of course, Abby's credentials as a science writer are impressive. However, she is so much more than a terrific writer. She is a mother. Lincoln and Lucas, her boys, already share her love of water in general and rivers in particular. She is a wife, married her high school sweetheart. In asking Abby to add a few more personal touches to this introduction, I learned that she was the fastest runner throughout her elementary school years, and in the 6th grade, she was known as the girl who could name all the major bones in the body faster than anyone else, faster, she noted, than her classmate who later became a physician. However, Abby is foremost a storyteller who captures the wonder and at times the terror of nature. I would especially recommend her essay From Meander Scars, Dread. It has the opening sentence, water tumbled over my head. All I could remember is the shock of it, not the cold, but knowing that I had fallen in, that I had tipped my kayak and spilt my things in the Willamette. She's gonna beat Louise Penny, I would say. Abby brings to this review scholarship and a deep understanding of how geography affects how we individuals navigate place, both physical place as well as social place. As she notes in Story Mapping, one of her essays in Meander Scars, stories of the land fascinate me because they reveal the intricate tangle between humans and the places they live, the topography of both earth and storytelling. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Abby Phillips. Abby, how good to see you.
Good to see you too, Carol. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, it was all true.
Well, and Carol and I have crossed paths in many capacities, this being a new one, and so far it's a fun one. But I want to thank you all for having me here, wherever here is for you. For me, it is in my office on the Oregon State University campus, whereas Carol noted, I work in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. I want to thank the Friends of the Public Library, and especially to the organizers, Deborah Goldenberg and Connie Georgiou, Bonnie for her support. Thank you for supporting this longstanding program and ensuring that we have a fantastic monthly review of wonderful literature and books. So we're going to talk about a really fascinating read, well-researched, called The Address Book, What Street Addresses Reveal About Identity, Race, Wealth, and Power, by Deirdre Mask. And if you have not read the novel or the book, you might be wondering, how could one fill up an entire a manuscript about addresses? I had the same thought, but as we will dive into today, there is a lot behind addresses, more than naming and numbering systems that demarcate space or help get our Amazon deliveries on time. So we'll go into some of that. So and as Carol mentioned, I wrote a book called Meander Scars and have a really novice love of maps. And it was indeed a map that inspired me to write that book at all. I had saw a historical map of the Willamette River as it was mapped by white settlers when they first arrived. And over years, the map changed, showing fewer and fewer channels. And so it really was a change map. And I became so interested in the interstitials, what happened in between those maps. How did those channels get lost? Where did they go? And what happened? And so this book really spoke to me on that level. And as I continued to write, I dove into other maps, historical maps, looking at former channels and sloughs and the shadowy scars of river bends that once were. And my favorite part of that project was hanging out with farmers who had lived alongside the Willamette River for generations, sometimes 100 years or more. And they could talk about the old sloughs and the channels that only meander in their minds. And it was clear to me then that memory is a very strong type of map. It tells of a place that once was. And just like any map, it can be distorted or aggrandized. So This was a very resonant book for me. And of course, I work with geographers who have a much more scientific and scholarly examination of maps, of cartographic techniques and geovisualizations to understand not just space, but culture, conflict, and a host of other social issues. So maps clearly have an innate power from the time of Babylonians who etched the landscape on clay tablets to these tiny little but powerful computers we hold in our hands linked to satellites orbiting incessantly. We are always looking for how to make sense of the world. We live in a location-based society. So that really set to me excitement at reading this book. So a little bit about this book at a glance. We will start this here. Hopefully you can see my slides. So the author, Deirdre Mask, this was her first book, and she describes herself as a writer, a lawyer, and a sometimes academic. And so she is an American journalist who lives in London. And while the book I would consider is largely historical, she brings in psychology and science and language. So it is a wonderfully researched book that weaves in a lot of different disciplines. And I love this bit that this plug by Tom Vanderbilt, author of Traffic and You May Also Like. He says of the work, I had hoped the address book would change the way I think about an oft overlooked, seemingly banal bit of everyday life. I had no idea it would so change the way I think about life itself. And indeed. And again, for those who haven't read, you might be wondering how that is true, but we'll get into that. So it's the author covers 4 continents in the Caribbean. So this is not a Western take of how Western society organizes its streets, naming streets and numbering them. And unlike a traditional historical nonfiction, it's not a straight tell. It is not what I would call a historical resume with some chronology. Deirdre brings in different times and places in a single span of an essay, weaving together different parallels. And in that way, it's a vastly more interesting read, although it made for a more challenging review because it simply was challenging to sometimes recall exactly where you were. So, and she also sprinkles the book with fascinating characters and just the right amount of humor. And I think that her ability to tackle a weighty subject yet also bring in these kind of heroes and the humor made for a well-balanced narrative here. So the premise of the book really derives from what seems to be a really simple question with no simple answer. Why do street addresses matter? And the author herself asked herself this question as she was mailing a letter from London to her father in the United States, wondering how this sticky little stamp in the corner, this fairly cheap, could send this letter not only across an ocean, but to the exact street and house and doorway of her father. And what happened to the stamp? Who gets the proceeds? Is it split between the two nations? And so that led her to just understand more the bureaucracy behind the mailing system and how mail moves throughout the world. But Deirdre obviously got a lot more than she bargained for, understanding how the addresses actually communicate power in our history, how it may show our ugly side of history. So this quote that I'm about to show really kind of summarizes the sentiment that we think of street addresses as purely functional and administrative tools, and I certainly did prior to reading this book. But they tell a grander narrative of how power has shifted and stretched over centuries. Indeed. The book is organized by several discrete sections, which I found very helpful in its framing because, as I mentioned, each essay is a blend and weaving and braid of a lot of different ideas. So having this scaffolding helped organize my thoughts or make me, allowed me to just ensure I knew where we were in space and time. So she goes into development, origins, politics, race, class, and status. And we'll walk through each of these sections. I will do my best to touch on every chapter. Some I will spend a little more time on that were particularly appealing to me, others less so. But we begin, really, I'm kind of melding the introduction and the first chapter in West Virginia and Kolkata. So these are two places that are largely unmapped. They're invisible, don't have street addresses or street names. This rural West Virginia town in particular, I should specify. And that's surprising because in the United States, we prize ourselves on the detail of information, right? And it was really interesting for me to hear that this rural community didn't have addresses largely and gave directions in narrative form. Well, you turn by the old oak grove and you'll see a big porch there. And it reminded of my time when I was in Costa Rica and was absolutely confounded by the lack of what I could discern if was any street name. And likewise, folks navigated through a narrative form, sometimes problematic narrative, like, hey, turn left when you see a dog on a porch, not to mention that the dog has been dead for 10 years. So here we learn about communities that move about in different ways. And Kolkata is a very different place than rural West Virginia, but likewise has whole slews, a Byzantine network of slums and quasi roads that make it incredibly challenging to understand most fundamentally who is there. So we learn about an effort to use QR codes to identify houses in Kolkata, which might seem really a small thing compared to what is probably a real need for very vital services like healthcare and food. But as the author points out, an address is an antecedent to those things. Once we are known, once we have place, we can then deliver said services and locate those in need. So I think the author here also touches on an interesting point, that how was it that so many residents in this community were not mapped, were not addressed? And it reflects a time of British rule and showing that the British simply did not care who its Indian subjects were. So addressing is a kind of democracy. And not only that, obviously it allows fundamental things like for your voter registration and securing land ownership, but it's also simply a sense of inclusion. And this was a point I found really important, that once you belong, once you have an address, you are among that community. You are counted and you are visible. Deirdre also touches on something. Is there an upside to not having an address? I think most of us here would say, oh my gosh, no. But as she cites in the residents of this rural West Virginia town, being under the radar has its advantages. It can kind of have a level of autonomy. They're not being necessarily subversive to the state, but they can move about with a level of freedom by being slightly invisible. So I found that a really interesting point. We then move to Haiti and health, where she asks the question, could street addresses stop a pandemic? And boy, what prescience did she have in writing this chapter, as we're in the middle of a pandemic? And I think about, I signed up for an alert on my phone to be notified if I've been in close proximity to a known exposure, known COVID case, right? And in that way, it allows me some agency to take whatever action I need to do to stay safe, but it also allows healthcare officials to map disease, understanding outbreaks and clusters and hotspots, not just where and when it's happening, but maybe how it's happening. Is it spreading this way or that way? And so before we go to Haiti, Deirdre actually takes us to London, where she introduces John Snow, who was mapping a cholera outbreak. And at the time, they thought it might have been spreading by air. This is where we get things like malaria, bad air. And it turns out, really, they were drinking their own excrement. And that was only made discoverable when John Snow started mapping these outbreaks and understanding they were clustering around this certain pump, right? Tipping them off that it wasn't air, it was, you know, contaminated water. So fast forward then to Haiti, and this is an example where Deirdre weaves in these two seemingly disparate places and times. We moved to Haiti. For some of you might recall, in 2010, there was a powerful earthquake that rumbled under Haiti, and it killed, I think, about 150,000 people. And the problem here is that it was an area, Port-au-Prince, that was not well mapped, if at all. So optimizing rescue services and other rescue missions was nearly impossible. So what happened is concerned citizens used OpenStreetMap to crowdsource and produce the most detailed roadmap of Haiti ever produced in just a matter of days. And a researcher in our college also cited this effort and noted that on top of this newly created map that made this region discoverable, right, there were also live tweets being sent out as kind of digital rescue flares for the distress. And as a result, scores of lives were saved. So here we see that maps aren't just about making sense of space and where we are, but are essential to health, our safety, and well-being. The book then moves into my favorite thrust, is the origins of addresses. And this is just simply who I am as a person. I love learning, why is that so? How did it get to be so? But there's a lot of power in this section of the book. So Deirdre takes us to ancient Rome and asks the question, how did they navigate? It turns out that the majority of Rome's 60 miles of street had no names. So they had types of streets, like that's a bridge, but not street names themselves. So I'm thinking about my time in Costa Rica and confounded that I can't get around. But this is where we learn about this concept of distinctive features that allow us to make mental maps of space. So these distinctive features might be paths or little nodes or edges and landmarks, distinct regions. So when we think about a place like Jersey City that I've never been, but is cited in the book as sort of being featureless, it's also challenging for a newcomer to really understand where they are. And Rome apparently had this on hyperdrive, not only having these features, but a sensory experience as well, being able to smell where you were. Okay, we're entering where they're going to be making the spices and such. And so I began to think about Corvallis and whether we have distinctive features. And I wouldn't say we're a Rome, but we certainly have landmarks like the river to the east and Mary's Peak to the west. We may not have discrete districts, but we talk about Timber Hill and downtown and campus, and we do have a Central Park. So I would argue that Corvallis is distinctive, and someone might be able to create a mental map quite easily coming here. Which brings up the question in our digital age, as we rely ever more so on these tiny little, very powerful computers robotically telling us which way to turn, what does that do to our capacity to create mental maps? And I've certainly been guilty of this. When I put in an address, I blindly follow my little robot, I arrive, and I can't tell you how I got there. And instead, what would happen if I poured over the map, got a sense of where I was, looked around, started making these mental notes. So it's, you know, like with any tool, we get an advance, but we also might lose something. So this is a question of the ages of what will our increasingly digital world do to our capacity to really explore and understand space. Okay, we then move to London, and this is my favorite chapter, and partly because we get at the heart of where do street addresses come from. And partly why I love this is because of the absurdly practical nature of early London street names, and I clearly do not know enough about. I've been to London one time. I don't understand British bawdiness. I mean, some of their street names were just straight up crass. For instance, a street name that was indicating where you could find a lady of the night, you know? So they were not just straight names, but signposts, almost like Vegas light up signs. So I clearly have a lot to learn about British culture here. And so here Deirdre has obviously well-researched prose here, but just a lot of humor and a lot of kind of more scatological references that I really kept the momentum going of this book. And so then she moves on as we become more modern. There's problems with the way that we name our streets. There's a lot of duplication. We have 52 versions of New Street in London. And so how un-new is that? And so then she launches into kind of post office reform and this first instance of mechanizing the way that we mail and map and address. So in England, prior, the recipient paid postage, not the sender. And the reform instituted kind of a flat rate for a more democratized, equitized system. London was divided into different districts, each with a number, what we would call a zip code. And fun fact, I did not know this. Zip code stands for Zoning Improvement Plan. It's one of those words like Kleenex that had just become synonymous with the thing. You know, I had no idea that it actually stood for something. So again, here is where we see kind of the, in at least a Western sense, first modernization and mechanization of street addresses. We then zip into even deeper origins of Vienna in the 1770s, of when Maria Theresa, the monarch at the time, had a very early instance of numbering houses. And she did this for maybe more nefarious purposes, but obviously, if you know where your subjects are, it makes it easier to tax, imprison, and police them. You can squeeze out more money. And in the case of Maria Theresa, she needed more soldiers for her war, and what better way to find them than to number them? So she ordered that all the houses be numbered and to be inscribed throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And she actually specified that these numbers be inscribed, quote, in thick black paint made from oil and boiled bones. I just love that detail, that it had to be boiled bones. And that just raised a lot of questions for me. Like, do boiled bones do they weather a little bit better? Does it make the paint stay on better? You know, so more research is definitely needed on my part. So as a result, these citizens became discoverable. And of course, there was a revolt. There was an effort to remove these numbers. And I'm thinking back to the rural West Virginia town that enjoyed being a little invisible. And likewise, this played out here in Vienna in this quote, kind of summarizing that sentiment. If they couldn't see you, they couldn't own you. So that's an interesting reflection point for me. The last of I'm kind of smushing two chapters because I thought that they juxtapose really well. We learn about Philly versus Korea and Japan. And in the chapter about Philadelphia, Deirdre really flexes her muscle in historical research. We learn all about a Quaker who comes across land and develops maybe the first instance of the American grid system that we just so love and depend on. I absolutely love grids. It's part and parcel of being an American, it seems like. Versus a place like Japan, like in Tokyo, where they largely do not have streets named. They have their blocks named. And this is where Deirdre really brings in language and some philosophy. And I just loved the cerebral nature of these chapters. And the premise that she explores of why does one culture have this nicely little tidy grid and another that doesn't really even name its streets, but its blocks. And she explores this premise that it might have something to do with the structure of written words. And bear with me, you might be going, what? How is that so? Well, the written structure of Japanese emphasizes blocks of characters that together, that holistically mean something, rather than in English, lines of letters that only mean something when they've been strung together in a certain sequence. And in the same way, our maps are structured in that way. So our language and the way we encode that language is inflected in the way that we actually map and grid our streets. So if our language is based on a blocking system, maybe so is our naming of our streets. And if our language is really based on lines of letters, we might want to label every single street. I just found that absolutely fascinating. It shows that addresses and maps are constructs that are culturally based, language based, right? So this is a fantastic blend of a lot of different disciplines in it. Again, one of her more cerebral chapters. We are going to move into politics here. And Iran and Ireland, you might go, what in the world do they have anything to do with each other? And what do they have to do with addresses? So we're dropped into like the 1980s, I think, where two young folks in Iran, they paint over a street sign and they change it to Bobby Sands. And Bobby Sands was a member of the Irish Republican Army who died of a hunger strike in 1981. And he was really mythologized in Iran, which we'll talk about in a minute as to why that is, almost more so than in his home country. And so these two young gentlemen painted over the sign, and the name stuck. Soon there were people in taxis asking to be taken to Bobby Sands Street. So to me, this was an instance of naming as assertion of power, and in this case, subversion, an act of political dissidence. So to name something is to assert power over it. And we see that here in Oregon, certainly with white settlers coming in, early settlers and early explorers saying that's Mount Hood. Well, actually, it's Wy'east. And so names matter. What we label them, how we encode them matter. And it is an assertion of power. So why was Bobby Sands so popular in Iran? Well, you know, from the way that Deirdre explains it, he was a mortal enemy of the British, and that narrative just really rang true in Iran. So here, Deirdre really shows her ability to braid in historical parallels. She brings in story not just from Iran and Ireland, but from China and the US Capitol. And I have to admit, this is a spot where I got a little lost, almost like I was wandering in Tokyo and there were no street names, but only block names. And that's not a critique on the author, but simply a recognition that there are places in this book where you really have to pay attention. We move into a far grittier, uglier point in history in Germany and Berlin and Nazi street names. And this was a hard chapter for me to read in places. And by 1938, right before Adolf Hitler was going to invade Poland, it became illegal to have a street named Jew. And Deirdre includes snippets of German citizens asking that names be removed. So it was a point of erasure. And here Deirdre shows how street names can act as propaganda. You can say them without thinking. Take me to Adolf Hitler Street. You know, the sting and the bite is removed. They become automatic in our lexicon. And so it just shows masters of propaganda that the Nazis were at that time. So then it begs the question of post-war. There was this naming schism between East-West Germany and those different politics and those different ideologies, and what happened after reunification. And it turns out, even if we are physically or have a reunification, that our names are much more latent to catch up. There's still debates on what should be named, what should be taken down, right? So there's a quote that Deirdre includes that was, to me, summarized this idea that we all have the need to confront the past, memorialize it, struggle with it, that's key, do something with it, and that something often involves street names. So there is political power in the way that we name or don't name where we are. It's kind of the takeaway for me here. We move into race, into Hollywood, Florida, and this is not what Deirdre said, it's what I'm saying. What's up with Confederate street names? This just felt all too resonant as we're talking about taking down monuments and the debate of, this lost cause rhetoric, and isn't that so long ago? Why are we caring? And here we meet a hero of the book, Benjamin Israel, an African-American Orthodox Jew who doggedly advocates to change Confederate street names. He lives in a place where there was lynchings and really strict Jim Crow laws, right? So that name, you could argue, well, that's long ago, but it still speaks to a time of unspeakable violence, right? So here Deirdre brings up things that we're seeing in the media today of arguing, you know, when people argue that was a long time ago, it has nothing to do with us, that this is taking away our history, right? And she says a quote here that I'm still kind of stewing over and don't quite know what to make with, but I know it's important and I'm going to share it here. And that is, memorializing the past is just another way to wishing about the future. So there is a narrative link between where we are and where we've been. And in the case of Confederate street names or emblems or other things, I think there's also a distortion of that narrative link, of making it align to where we are, right? That lost cause rhetoric, that this was a noble cause. So really asking, what does it mean when we keep an emblem of hate and violence, in this case, a street name? We then move to St. Louis, where we learn about MLK streets and race. And some of you might remember our own MLK debacle in Portland some 20 years ago, where there was quite a bit of resistance to renaming that street. And that really doesn't comport with our idea of Portland now, as it is parodied in comedy shows as being a bastion of liberalism. But back then, and maybe even still today, there was white supremacist activities, right? I think what was heartbreaking to me about this chapter is that we see the power of a name in a street. So when MLK died in 1968, was assassinated, the Black communities clamored to change their street names as a way to honor and remember and assert, right? And in what I consider just a ironic twist, and some of these streets became some of the most violent in a community, kind of perversion of, if you build it, they will come. Well, what came wasn't what was supposed to come, was the vision. And that's certainly what happens in this chapter in a community where a person named Melvin White wonders, why is there a street name in my community not far away named Delmar Boulevard that has restaurants and bustling shops and bougie little eateries? And this MLK street has violence and is economically depressed. And so we follow his journey to try and bolster this MLK street, his dogged effort, his setbacks. And to me, again, this was indicative that there is a power in a name, a power to divide and to determine who belongs and who doesn't, who gets to walk on MLK Street, who gets to enjoy an eatery in Delmar Boulevard, right? So this becomes partitioning and othering that happens just in a name. Okay, so then we move into South Africa, and I say this is my least favorite chapter, not unkindly, but one of them has to be your least favorite, I suppose. And it's simply because I think so much has been written about South Africa and apartheid that I found myself more interested in the little known places and stories. Nonetheless, this was still a very important chapter exploring who belongs on South Africa's street signs. And so under apartheid, many of the street names were in the, and I'm probably saying this wrong, in the Afrikaans language, or honored those whose government had largely designed and implemented apartheid. So this kind of like in post-German World War II or reunification, likewise, there's still debate on what should be taken down, what is considered honorific and what is considered maybe the oppressive. So there's still, I guess the main thrust for me here is that even when a system of oppression or violence or segregation is dissolved, there's still these vestiges of it, in this case, street signs. So then we move into the last section of this book, Class and Status. Manhattan, in a far swankier, glitzy chapter, talking about vanity addresses. We'll go into that a little bit. So in contrast with MLK, this chapter shows how a posh name can attract status and class in a distorted way. It almost reminds me of an essay that I read long ago where someone put up a sign saying that this is the most photographed barn in America. And it wasn't true until that was stated. And likewise, when you have a posh name that it speaks to some fantastic, environment, that then brings the posh and the class. So Deirdre here shows some interesting facts here that in the UK, for instance, street, if you live on a street, your house fetched less than if it were on lane. And 2 thumbs down to this one, but houses on roads named king or prince were worth more than those on queen and princess. Ugh, names. So in early Manhattan, names were an early form of gentrification, naming it in a way that told those who lived on the west side slums and shanty towns that they didn't belong. And in New York, addresses are for sale. You can apply to change the street address to something far more attractive. So this is the concept of a vanity address. And we hear about Donald Trump and his ability to evoke psychology in all this, that it's not really about location, 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 but just evoking the psychology of somebody to make them feel like they're living in a desirable place. So there's a little bit of a gag reflex for me in this chapter, but finally, we move into homelessness. This is a really, again, relevant topic in this day and time. It is a deeply stigmatizing thing. And we learn about another hero in New Haven, Connecticut, who really spends time with the homelessness to understand how do they get there, where their background. And we learn that they are not a monolith, right? And we learn about this vicious cycle of not having a home or an address. So in order to work, you need to have an address, but to have an address, you need to work. And so this hero in this chapter is advocating to abolish that requirement that you have an address on your application to work, right? In the same way, others have advocated to remove the felony status on an application. So then we move into a really interesting premise that do you actually need a house? Can you just have an address? If we can't give somebody a house, can we give them an address? If Santa Claus can have a fake address, why can't the homeless? So this was an entirely new concept to me, that there's scores of homes that are sitting empty because they might be second homes or third homes or vacation rentals or whatnot. And why not allow the homeless to use the addresses of empty houses? An interesting concept, and it was encouraging for me to see people thinking in innovative ways about those unhoused individuals. So, in conclusion, Deirdre brings us into an even more far-fetched concept of digital addressing. Our street address is doomed. So instead of dividing the world into coordinates that are numerical, could they be divided into words that are something more semantically rich? So she introduces this startup called What 3 Words that uses literally 3 words to mark where somebody lives or is at any given place. So my house might be cupcake, coffee, and donut, and I'm clearly like hungry right now for some treats. And that would tell you exactly where my house is. But there's a precision here that's even beyond that. It might tell you in a giant stadium how to get to that exact door of where the parking lot is. So it has immense power and potential. But as Deirdre asks, should addressing the world be a mercenary endeavor in the hands of a for-profit startup? And digital addresses don't really preserve the memory of a place. I live on Bridgeway, not cupcake, donut, coffee, or whatever I said, right? That doesn't have the meaning. It negates all of that power, history, culture, good and bad, right? So Deirdre leaves us with this idea that addressing the world is not a neutral act. It is laced and laden with power, culture, history, a tangled, complicated system that speaks to not only where we are, but who we are. So with that, I think I will bring Bonnie back on. And we will take questions from the audience. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abby. That was fascinating. I had no idea the significance of street addresses. So I want to welcome everybody to please submit any questions, comments, anything like that. Now is the time to do it. You should have something that looks like a little question mark that you can click on, and that expands a box where you can ask us a question. So I'll wait for some of those to roll in. While we wait, did I hear you correctly? So it was boiled bones for the, oh my gosh, wow. And
Indeed.
like,
And then I was like, what kind of bones? Like
yeah,
sheep?
that's what I was about to ask. I was like, what kind of
Specificity?
bones?
Like a marrow to bone ratio that's gonna, so again, like I said, more research is needed. Does that make it really hard to remove or?
Yeah, wow. That's wild. And then the idea of allowing homeless people to use other addresses, that's wow. I've never thought about that. That's such an interesting concept.
It
Yeah,
was
okay.
completely new to me as well, of like, well, do you need a home or do you need an address? Certainly we want everyone to have a home, but as a first step, could we have an address to literally put
Right,
an map and make them help them feel like they're just belonging there. So
absolutely. We did get a question coming in. Let's see. Um, Does the author bring in questions related to naming homes, like Morrow's Cottage, which is the name I want to name my home? Haha.
I don't know if I'm trying to recall. There's so much to this book. That's one thing I should say. It can be dense. I don't recall a precision of naming your house, but um, but I think there is discussion at least on, say, like cottage. That evokes a kind of sentiment and feeling that is kind of brought out in that Manhattan chapter of when we name a street, and when we name it in terms that are more favorable, it automatically kind of increases its value. So I don't know if there's something as precise as your house. You can certainly have the 3 words for your house. Maybe that's the next gen, though, is that we get to select what we name our own domiciles. I think that'd be really fascinating.
Yeah. And so related to that, Wendy asked, can you expand on using 3 words to describe a location?
Yeah, so this was a really new concept for me. They seem to be randomly generated, and the author cites an example where it's helped save lives. Like you're in a place that isn't really mapped or known, or you're out in the middle of between spaces. So this app could then say exactly where you are, and that's broadcast to somebody else. So it is mapped to actual coordinates. It's just those coordinates are words versus numbers, which might stick a little bit more in our human brain. So I have to admit, like I almost went to the what 3 words because I was like, this seems really bizarre. But again, the other thing that seemed unique about it wasn't just like, here is your house or here's the Taj Mahal. It's like, this is the west end of the Taj Mahal. So there's a granularity that comes with it. But it is a startup. They're a money making company. And Google has kind of a similar effort and is promised to make it free. But Google is also a total beast and mercenary company. And so, I applaud those startups for trying to think of innovative ways of digitally mapping, but I share concerns with the author that they're not the right folks to do it. They might have the technological know-how, but I don't know if their heart is in the right place. I strayed a little bit. I don't know if I really answered your question, but I'm with you. This is one of those things to me that I clearly need to do a little more research on. But I was kind of scared to like Google and go into it, like what 3 words, because I really want my home address to be like cupcake, coffee, donut, or whatever. I don't want it to be like rat, nematode, or something like that. So yeah. Nothing
Great.
against nematodes and little worms, but yeah.
Thank you. Nancy asks, I'm interested in the idea of the featurelessness of the one place in New Jersey. those that live there wouldn't think so. So this is a way of separating insiders from outsiders, don't you think? Is that idea addressed?
In a way, what I recall from that part is that they surveyed residents of Jersey City to see if they could note any of those distinct features. You know, are there parks? Are there, you know, is there a central, you know, downtown? And most residents couldn't. So I don't know if it was necessarily meant to create a schism. I think what would be interesting is to note how well an outsider could navigate, or assimilate how to navigate, right? And maybe even those who live there have a challenge. And here, maybe it's not as bad, but here's an example. I think about my mom lived and spent a significant amount of time in Europe. She grew up in Belgium, Brussels, and it's not the tidy little grid. There's certainly features, but it was kind of this winding thing. And even after living there for 7 years, she would get lost. So I don't know, do citizens or community members in Jersey City get lost? I don't know. I don't think Deirdre's intent was to create a sense of, you know, those who aren't familiar with that space versus those who are. There may be casualties of it being featureless for both populations, but certainly someone not familiar with that space would probably have a harder time mapping it.
Thank you. Molly wondered, did the author talk about gerrymandering?
Not really, and that's actually interesting that she did not, because obviously that's a huge topic right now, with elections and inflating political, yeah, anyway, she did not. So I have a feeling that there was probably, for every topic she did talk about, there were 12 others. And that was actually that she did not. That was a question for me that I wondered, how did she include what she did? Why those places? They were all fascinating, but every place is a place. And that sounds kind of a little silly, but certainly there, I had not necessarily with gerrymandering, but other topics that I thought, wow, that felt like a missed opportunity, or why here and not here. And some of it may have just been what she had the capacity to do or to travel, or just as her research unfolded. But short answer is no.
Thank you. Michelle asks, is there anything in the book, or do you have any comments on addresses that name what is no longer there? And so she gives some examples, as in Timber Hill, where all the trees are cut down, or Fox Run, where there are so many houses there are no foxes.
Yes, she does talk about that, either as vestiges of something that no longer is, or and sometimes names are given. So I always had this idea that there's a lot of meaning in a name. You know, when I see a street name, I'm like, that must mean something. And it's clear that sometimes it doesn't mean something anymore, like they have been removed. I saw this a lot when I lived in Bend, where there was a lot of nature-based names, but so much development that nature was no longer there. So she does touch on that. And she also just touches on certain names don't have any meaning. You know, there were no foxes ever. There were no trees ever. It just was a random person. I think that was when she was talking in the introduction in the rural community in West Virginia. Residents going, they were trying to decide on names in this kind of nameless rural town. And some of them were just either whims, inside jokes, or I live on, I think one of them was something to do with grapes, you know, there's no grapes here. So yes, there is instances of that. And I think it's a little bit, that can be a little bit tragic, like Timber Hill. Yeah, where's the timber? But it might be in its own way. If we didn't preserve the trees, we preserve the mention of them and the memory of them. It's a far cry and a far abstraction from the real thing, but I do still find that important.
Thank you. Barbara asks, is there any way to apply Google Maps to this conversation?
I don't know. I know there was one citation in the book of Google Maps where they erroneously noted a street in Germany that was still like Adolf Hitler, you know? So that was, I don't know how that happened or how that information, but what I can say is for me, Google Earth is, I love it because you can compare satellite images and look at change. So even if it wasn't brought up a lot in this book, I do think that there is probably an opportunity for this author to have brought in that tool. And even Google Earth Engine, which is a robust tool where people can program on top of it, and you can do these time lapses to see the growth of Las Vegas or a river cutting a new course. And so the author doesn't explicitly bring in a lot about this tool, but I know that Google is certainly, I mean, the leader when it comes to location-based services and in this digital mapping age. So I probably didn't really answer your question very well, but that's the best I can do.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. David asks, he says, at the start of the internet, to send an email, you had to specify a path to the addressee, listing the systems the message would pass through. Did she talk about using routing rather than final location for an address?
She did talk a little bit about kind of in London. I mentioned how like that got really mechanized and the naming and the zip codes. It was far more informal and more like a pathway, like, you know, down the lane where the two ducks live or something like that. It was sort of, it was a little bit near, and she gives examples in there. She has what the address would have looked like prior and what it looks like now based on this kind of more systematic approach. So I felt that really interesting. And a part of the book I didn't bring up was then the dead address. You know, there's this whole effort of folks who, what happens when mail is just not delivered? Somebody just addressed it wrong. And certainly that happened far more when there was more informal path-based addressing, right? And so I didn't know this. There's just this whole cadre of folks tasked with interpreting some pretty like asinine mistakes that people have made that just are misspellings of folks. Anyway, so I would say short answer is yes, and she has examples of some of those more path-based. It's maybe not exactly a parallel to what you're citing here, but I really liked the before and after, what it would have been and what it is now based on a more standard addressing system.
Cool. Something that he also says, which is kind of interesting, he says, I had a friend in the Peace Corps in Africa who received a letter addressed just to his name and the country name. The letter came from the US, so it was delivered to the US Embassy, which was able to locate the addressee.
There's
really
a little
interesting.
story for that of just like, how did it get from A to B with such scant information?
And I think we probably have time for one more. And they say, maybe you stated this, but in the 3-word concept, how much input does the community have in this naming convention?
My understanding, don't quote me on this, is not much. I think they're randomly generated. So, and that would be something I'd want to explore. And it could be a point of debate. Like, I wonder when you start getting in machine learning, machines sometimes reflect the mistakes of humans. Like, what if there's hate speech or like a name for something that means something very different in a specific community? So my understanding, this could be wrong, is that it's randomly generated, but I would hope that there is input, given that there probably will be instances of words that are offensive, you know, to certain communities, right? Machines make mistakes too, because they're a reflection of our mistakes, right?
Definitely. Great answer. And then just lots of stuff about what a great review this was. Fantastic presentation. Sparked a lot of people's curiosity for sure. Definitely mine. I have a lot of Googling to do after this.
Yeah, me too.
But thank you so much, Abby. I want to invite our other folks back, Connie and Deborah and Carol, just to send you all off with a nice farewell.
Thank you, Abby. That was really, really interesting. We're never going to take addresses for granted. ever again. And I certainly went right away when I finished the book to what 3 words and looked up my address. And they were 3 very, I don't remember them, they were very ordinary. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for participating. And we'll say goodbye and see you next month.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye. Thank you.